Now, the U.S. is asking Zimbabwe to help put down an Islamist insurgency in neighboring Mozambique, and that's destabilizing the region rich in natural gas. The request came in a phone call between U.S. Assistant Secretary for African Affairs Chibonage and Zimbabwean Foreign Minister Sibusiso Moyo last week. The foreign minister asked that the U.S. first drop targeted sanctions against Zimbabwean officials. Mozambique has been struggling to suppress the Islamic State-affiliated group that's destabilizing the region, as I said, where nearly $60 million in investment in natural gas facilities are planned by companies, including Total, SE, and ExxonMobil Corporation. Well, political analyst FARAI MUVUTI joins us now to discuss this story. Great to have you join us on Newsday here on the Arise News channel. Tell us, how bad is the crisis in Mozambique, and what's at stake here for the U.S. to try to intervene?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me yet again. Well, you find that Mozambique is a very carries with it a lot of strategic resources. Part of those resources are LNG, which is a natural gas, in which companies that you've just stated, and one of them being an American company, ExxonMobil, have invested billions into this particular project. Now, the situation appears to be deteriorating as of since the report started, since late 2017. We've then seen the displacement of over 300,000 families, and as a consequence, it's beginning to be a rising concern within the region. So there are strategic interests that are at risk here. And equally, there is the stability of the region that is equally at risk here.
All right, FARAI, let me even just ask you your take on what Zimbabweans are asking. I mean, what the country is asking US to do, which is help them combat militants in that region. What's your take on Zimbabwe asking US to come in?
Well, I think one could look at it from two perspectives. The first perspective is that they're asking a Zimbabwean military, which has extensive, in fact, I would argue probably the most experienced army within the region, considering the amount of peace combat trips they've done. They have been involved in Sierra Leone, they've been involved in Angola, they've been involved in DRC, they've been involved in the Central African Republic, and as well as Mozambique. If you look at historically, the Zimbabwe military army, which finds itself coming out of a political, during the War of Liberation in 1980, when it won that war against the British. It had bases within Mozambique, so it understands the terrain very well. But also post 1980, when the insurgency of Renamo, at the time fighting against Frelimo, Renamo being an insurgency group that had been created by the apartheid regime at the time to create instability within Mozambique, as to jeopardize its potential of having a successful independence, as to deter the prospect of ideals of freedom or independence within the region. Zimbabwe was one of the first military armies to go in and quarrel and stampede that particular insurgency. So they have extensive experience with dealing and bringing stability within the region. So it makes sense why the US would look to Zimbabwe, considering its extensive experience. But secondly, on the aspect on Zimbabwe's governmental side, you do understand that when Zimbabwe got engaged in the DRC war, when it fought under when it faced off the rebellion that was coming from Ugandan insurgents and Rwanda insurgents, who were at the time rumored to have been sponsored by the CIA, well, according to WikiLeaks reports. When Zimbabwe went in to bring stability in that region, it created a cause effect, or what we then call the long-term effects of the current sanctions that Zimbabwe currently has. So the first embargo that the US released was against the Zimbabwean military, which because Zimbabwe's military had the capacity to manufacture, it continues to manufacture bullets, guns, and tomahawks and so forth that they used to purchase from the British. But as a consequence of the sanctions, they have now had to domesticate that production process. which meant that it destabilized Zimbabwe's ability to sell arms to other countries, which was quite a huge industrial. It had huge industrial returns as a consequence. So what they're asking is, well, if you want us to engage, then there should be a mutual interest approach, which means that you must begin to look at removing the sanctions that disallow our military to perform in its full capacity. And that will be a first stage for Zimbabwe being able to strategically deal with the insurgency in Mozambique currently. But I think one must also add that, irrespective of the sanctions existing, Zimbabwe has continued to be in a number of peacekeeping arrangements, and I would also equally argue that this is not the first time that Zimbabwe and the U.S. meet from a combat perspective. If you may recall, in 1993 in Somalia, when the U.S. was struggling with that particular bringing stability within the country, it was Zimbabwean military troops who went and saved the day. So there is that experience and there is that background. The question would be, if indeed the U.S. interests are in jeopardy, and they are requiring the Zimbabwean military to engage with this situation, the argument then would be, what do they have to offer? And I think that's where the Zimbabwean government is attempting to address this issue so that it could be of mutual interest and mutual benefit.
Indeed, and I was going to ask, how willing is the U.S. to lift these sanctions? Though repeatedly they say the sanctions is not on the country, but on 85 government officials, 56 companies in Zimbabwe, as well as the military exports that you talked about. So how willing is the U.S. to compromise and lift these sanctions? And what has been the response of the opposition MDC to this? Because the government argues that the sanctions are imposed because the opposition alliance continues to draw the attention of the international community, especially the U.S., to the country.
Well, I think this is a very good question. I think, firstly, the U.S. position, if we're going to look at it by the Southern African Times, we covered it yesterday, and based on the reports that we're seeing, it's yet to be seen how indeed the U.S. will intend to bypass Congress and state issues relating to national security. I would imagine that if it indeed is seen to be a national security issue, there might be high value in the U.S. readdressing or readdressing this issue from that perspective. So there might be a consensus, but it's yet to be seen. U.S. politics, as you can imagine, especially during the electoral campaign mode, tends to be very unpredictable. So I think it's yet to be seen. Now, just to refer to your point on what the Zimbabwean government is arguing, the Zimbabwean government for years has argued that, well, these sanctions, even though they're called smart sanctions, the problem is that, one, they are illegal because they are unilateral. They do not have a bilateral approach, as they are not imposed by the UN, who have the sole right of imposing sanctions. But also, they are arguing that, well, let's pretend that we agree with the Americans that indeed these sanctions are just targets. However, the problem is that they put on a country a tagline which deters investment, which equally diminishes the prospect of economic growth as a consequence of that tagline itself. So that's what they're arguing. But in specific terms, the governors over the years tried to demonstrate that when we in terms of, for example, banking infrastructure, there is no corresponding banks in Zimbabwe as a consequence of these sanctions. So which means that when one wants to transact, transacts in Zimbabwe and comes with their Barclays card and goes over to say, Zambia or next door and tries to withdraw money from their account, ordinary citizens are impacted in terms of being able to do business. Normal transactions, day-to-day transactions are impacted. Healthcare institutions are equally impacted, and that's their argument. Now, on the opposition side, there hasn't been much commentary in as far as this report is concerned. I would imagine it is as a consequence of the internal fights that the opposition is currently facing amongst themselves. So I think that is more of a preoccupation. But you are right that the government has over the years accused the MDC of weaponizing the sanctions as to find and gain political mileage within the domestic electoral landscape.
All right, one wonders really what is the extent of the fury of these militants in that region and then the economic implications. But we'll leave it there for now. Thank you so much, FARAI MUVUTI, journalist.